After working for 30 years in the tech industry, I finally did it. I retired at 55 with enough money saved up to buy the property I'd been dreaming about since I was a kid. No more traffic jams, no more meetings, no more staring at computer screens until my eyes burned. I wanted something simple, something real. A place where I could wake up, grab my fishing rod, and spend the morning doing absolutely nothing but watching the water. I spent 6 months looking at properties all over the state. Some were too small, some were too expensive, and most of them were just regular houses with regular yards. Nothing special. But then my real estate agent called me one Tuesday afternoon and said she found something I needed to see. She wouldn't even describe it over the phone, just told me to meet her the next morning. When I pulled up to the address, I honestly thought she'd made a mistake. The driveway wound through tall pine trees for about a quarter mile before opening up to this beautiful old house. But that wasn't even the best part. Behind the house, maybe 100 yards back, was a lake. Not a pond, not some muddy hole in the ground, but an actual lake. About half an acre of clear, clean water with cattails growing around the edges, and a wooden dock stretching out into the middle. The property was 5 acres total, and every single inch of it was gorgeous. The seller was an older gentleman whose family had owned the land for 3 generations. He was moving to be closer to his daughter in another state, and seemed genuinely sad to be leaving. We walked down to the lake together, and he told me about the springs that fed it, how his grandfather had stocked it with bass and catfish back in the 60s, and how he'd spent every summer of his childhood swimming and fishing right there. I didn't even try to negotiate the price. I wanted that property more than I'd wanted anything in years. We closed the deal in 3 weeks, and I moved in on a sunny Saturday in early spring. The first thing I did, before I even finished unpacking, was grab my tackle box and head down to that dock. I cast my line into the water as the sun was setting, and I swear I felt every ounce of stress from the last 3 decades just melt away. This was it. This was exactly what retirement was supposed to feel like. The neighborhood itself was called Pinewood Estates, and it was a mix of older properties like mine and some newer developments on smaller lots. Most of my neighbors seemed friendly enough. People waved when they drove by, and a few of them stopped to introduce themselves during my first couple weeks. Everyone said the same thing, basically. "Welcome to the neighborhood. It's real quiet here. You're going to love it." There was a homeowners association which I'd known about before buying the place. Honestly, I didn't think much of it. The monthly fees were reasonable. They maintained the common areas and the main entrance, and the rules seemed pretty standard. Keep your lawn mowed, don't paint your house weird colors, that kind of thing. I'd read through all the documents during the buying process, and nothing seemed like a red flag. About 6 weeks after I moved in, I got a notice in the mail about the monthly HOA meeting. I figured it would be good to show up, meet some more neighbors, see how things worked. The meeting was held at a small community center near the entrance of the neighborhood. When I walked in, there were maybe 20 people scattered around folding chairs, drinking coffee from a big percolator in the corner. The woman running the meeting was named Helen. She was probably in her mid-60s, dressed in a blazer and slacks like she was heading to a business meeting instead of a neighborhood gathering. She ran through the agenda items with this very precise, no-nonsense attitude. Landscaping budget, playground maintenance, upcoming street repairs. Everything was organized. Everything was documented. Everything was done by the book. When she asked if there were any new residents who wanted to introduce themselves, I stood up and gave a little wave. Told everyone my name, mentioned I'd just retired from the tech industry, and said I was really happy to be part of the community. A few people smiled and nodded. Helen looked at me with this tight expression that I couldn't quite read and said welcome to Pinewood Estates in a tone that didn't sound particularly welcoming. Then I made what I thought was just friendly conversation. I mentioned how much I was enjoying the property, especially the lake, and how I'd been fishing almost every morning since I moved in. It was just small talk, you know. The kind of thing you say when you're trying to be friendly and make connections with new neighbors. But Helen's expression changed. Just slightly, but I noticed it. Her eyes narrowed just a bit, and she sort of pursed her lips before moving on to the next agenda item. At the time, I figured maybe she was just that kind of person. Serious, all business, not much for chit-chat. I didn't think anything of it. After the meeting, I stuck around for a few minutes talking to some of the other residents. An older couple who lived 3 streets over, a guy about my age who worked from home, a retired teacher who'd been in the neighborhood for 15 years. Everyone was genuinely nice and welcoming. The retired teacher even mentioned that he'd fished in my lake years ago, when the previous owner had invited some neighbors over for a 4th of July barbecue. Said it was full of some real nice bass. I left that meeting feeling pretty good about things. Sure, the HOA president seemed a bit stiff, but that was fine. I wasn't looking to become best friends with everyone. I just wanted to live peacefully, enjoy my property, and fish whenever I felt like it. What I didn't know, what I had absolutely no way of knowing at that time, was that Helen had actually tried to buy my property years earlier. The previous owner had refused to sell to her. I didn't find that out until much later, but it explained a whole lot about what was about to happen. For the next few weeks, everything was perfect. I settled into a routine that felt like exactly what I'd dreamed about during all those years of working. I'd wake up around sunrise, make a pot of coffee, and head down to the lake with my rod and tackle box. Some mornings I'd catch 3 or 4 fish. Some mornings I wouldn't catch anything at all. It didn't matter. Just being out there watching the mist come off the water, hearing the birds wake up, feeling the cool morning air, that was enough. I'd spend the middle of the day fixing things around the house, reading or just relaxing on the back porch. In the evenings, I'd sometimes go back down to the lake for another hour or 2 of fishing. It was peaceful in a way that's hard to describe if you've spent decades in the corporate world. No deadlines, no pressure, no stress. Just me and the water and all the time in the world. I noticed a white car driving slowly past my property a few times during the 3rd month. It would cruise by real slow, like someone was trying to get a good look at something. I figured maybe it was someone thinking about buying property in the area, or just a curious neighbor. Didn't seem like a big deal, but then the letter showed up, and that's when my peaceful retirement paradise started turning into something else entirely. The letter was sitting in my mailbox on a Wednesday afternoon. I'd just gotten back from town after grabbing some groceries, and there it was. Official-looking envelope, HOA return address, the whole 9 yards. I figured it was probably just some routine neighborhood update, or maybe a reminder about the next meeting. I tossed the groceries on the kitchen counter and opened the envelope. What I read made absolutely no sense at first. I had to go back and read it twice, then a 3rd time, just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding something. The letter was from Helen, the HOA president. It was all formal and legal sounding, talking about Section 14.3 of the Community Guidelines. According to her, any recreational water activities had to be done in accordance with the rules, and I needed to get permits for using natural water features that might impact community aesthetics or wildlife. She was saying I needed permission to fish in my own lake, on my own property. The lake that was completely surrounded by my land and didn't even come close to touching any property lines. I stood there in my kitchen reading this thing over and over, getting more confused each time. Impact community aesthetics? It was my private lake. Nobody could even see it from the street. You had to walk 100 yards through my property to even know it existed. And wildlife? The fish had been stocked there by the previous owner's family decades ago. This wasn't some protected wetland or nature preserve. I went straight to my office and pulled out the massive folder of documents from when I bought the house. I'm talking about the deed, the title, the property survey, the original HOA agreement, everything. I spent the entire evening going through every single page, looking for anything that mentioned needing permission to use water on my own property. Nothing. Not one single word about it. The HOA rules talked about swimming pools needing certain fences, and there was something about not damaging common areas, but my lake wasn't a common area. It was private property. My private property. I'd paid good money for it, and the lake was specifically listed as one of the features of the land. The next morning, I called the HOA office. Got their voicemail and left what I thought was a pretty reasonable message. Explained that I'd received the letter, that my lake was completely on my private property, and asked if there was some kind of misunderstanding. I kept my tone polite and friendly. No reason to start off on the wrong foot, right? Helen called me back within an hour. I could tell from her voice that she wasn't happy, but I figured we'd just clear this up like adults. I explained again that the lake was entirely on my property and asked what specific rule I was supposedly violating. She went into this whole speech about how all properties in Pinewood Estates fall under HOA jurisdiction, and how I needed to submit a formal application for recreational water use. She kept using these big official-sounding phrases like they were supposed to intimidate me. I asked her to show me exactly where in the HOA documents It said I needed permission to fish on my own land. There was this long pause, and then she said something that really stuck with me. She said, "We'll be monitoring the situation," and just hung up. Didn't answer my question, didn't explain anything, just hung up the phone. That's when I started to realize this wasn't really about rules or regulations. Something else was going on here, but I couldn't figure out what. I'd never done anything to this woman, never had a conflict with her, barely even knew her, but she was acting like I'd personally insulted her or something. I decided to just ignore the whole thing and keep living my life. I mean, what were they going to do? It was my property. I owned it. I had every right to fish in my own lake, so that's exactly what I did. Kept my morning routine, went down to the dock with my coffee and my fishing rod, enjoyed my retirement exactly the way I'd planned. For about 2 weeks, everything was quiet. No more letters, no more phone calls. I started thinking maybe Helen had realized she was wrong and dropped the whole thing. I should have known better. It was a Saturday morning and I'd caught a really beautiful largemouth bass. Had to be at least 4 pounds, maybe more. I was in the middle of reeling it in, completely focused on the fish, when I heard vehicles coming down my driveway. Not just one vehicle, multiple vehicles. I turned around and saw 2 sheriff's department cars pulling up near my house. My heart started pounding because, when cops show up unannounced, you tend to assume something bad has happened. Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe someone in the neighborhood had been robbed. I had no idea. 2 deputies got out of their cars, and right behind them was Helen and another person from the HOA board. They all started walking toward the lake, toward me. I reeled in my line and set down my rod, trying to figure out what on earth was happening. The older of the 2 deputies called out and asked if I was the property owner. I said yes, and he asked if he could talk to me for a minute. He was polite about it, professional, but I could tell something was up. He explained that they'd received a report about illegal fishing activities. Someone had called and said there might be poaching happening from a protected water source. I actually laughed at first because I thought he had to be joking. But he wasn't joking. Helen had actually called the sheriff's department and reported me for fishing in my own lake. I showed the deputy my fishing license, which was completely valid and up to date. Then the other deputy asked if he could walk around the property a bit, and I said, "Sure, go ahead." He and Helen walked the entire perimeter of the lake while I stood there with the first deputy, trying to explain the situation. The deputy was actually pretty understanding. He could see I was as confused as he was. While we waited for his partner to finish looking around, I explained about the letter I'd gotten, about the lake being entirely on my property, about how I'd bought this place specifically because of the lake. When the other deputy came back, he and Helen had clearly been having some kind of conversation. Helen's face was red and she looked angry. The deputy told her very calmly and professionally that my fishing license was valid. The lake was on my property, and there was no violation of any law. He said they couldn't take any action because no crime had been committed. Helen started going on about community regulations and HOA rules and how I was violating all these policies. The senior deputy cut her off and explained in the same calm voice that HOA matters were civil issues, not criminal ones. He suggested we work it out through proper channels and that calling the sheriff's department wasn't the appropriate way to handle an HOA dispute. I could see Helen getting more and more upset as the deputy spoke. Her whole face was turning red and her hands were shaking a little. The deputies thanked me for my cooperation, apologized for the inconvenience, and headed back to their cars. Before Helen left, she turned to me and said something I'll never forget. She looked me right in the eye and said, "You haven't heard the last of this. There are rules in this community and nobody is above them." Then she and the other board member walked back to their car and drove off. I stood there on my dock watching them leave, and it finally hit me. This wasn't about rules or regulations or community standards. This was personal. For some reason I didn't understand yet, Helen had it out for me. And she wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. The question was, what exactly did she want? And more importantly, how far was she willing to go? I picked up my fishing rod and looked out at the water. My peaceful retirement paradise suddenly felt a whole lot less peaceful. The fight was just getting started and I had no idea how bad it was going to get. 3 days after the sheriff showed up, I got another letter. This time it came by certified mail, which meant I had to sign for it. That's never a good sign. When something comes certified mail, you know it's serious. I opened it right there at the mailbox, and what I read made my blood pressure shoot through the roof. The HOA was fining me $500 for unauthorized recreational water use. $500. And it got worse. The letter said that if I continued to violate the rules, they'd fine me an additional $200 per day. For fishing in my own lake on my own property. I'm not someone who gets angry easily. I spent 30 years in the tech industry dealing with difficult clients, impossible deadlines, and office politics. I learned how to stay calm under pressure. But standing there at my mailbox, reading that letter, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pure, absolute rage. But I also knew that anger wasn't going to solve anything. I needed help, real help. The kind that comes with a law degree and experience dealing with situations exactly like this one. I spent that afternoon making phone calls and doing research. I talked to 3 different attorneys before I found one who specialized in HOA disputes. Her name was Rebecca, and from the minute I described my situation to her over the phone, I could tell she knew exactly what she was dealing with. We met at her office the next morning. I brought my entire folder of documents, everything from the purchase of the property to the letters from Helen. Rebecca went through it all, taking notes, asking questions, really digging into the details. When she got to the part about the $500 fine and the $200 per day threat, she actually laughed. Not a polite little chuckle, but a real, genuine laugh. I asked her what was funny about potentially owing thousands of dollars in fines. She looked up at me with this big smile and said that Helen had just made a huge mistake. Then she showed me something I'd completely missed in all my reading of the documents. My property deed was old. Really old. It dated back more than 40 years before the HOA was even created. And right there in the original HOA charter, there was a section about grandfathered properties. Properties that existed before the HOA was formed got special protections. And my lake was specifically listed as a grandfathered private water feature. It was right there in black and white, in the original documents that Helen should have read before sending me any letters. Rebecca explained that Helen either hadn't done her homework, or she'd conveniently forgotten about this clause. Either way, the HOA had absolutely no authority to regulate my use of the lake. None. Zero. I didn't need their permission. I didn't need their permits, and I certainly didn't owe them any fines. I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't breaking any rules. Helen had been wrong this entire time. And now I had an attorney who could prove it. Rebecca drafted a cease and desist letter that same day. It was beautiful. Professional, firm, and absolutely loaded with legal references and citations. She laid out exactly why the HOA had no authority over my lake, included copies of all the relevant documents, and warned them that any continued harassment would result in legal action. She sent it off that afternoon. For about a week, everything was quiet. No letters, no phone calls, no cars driving slowly past my property. I actually started to relax a little bit. Maybe Helen had finally realized she was wrong. Maybe this whole nightmare was over. I should have known better. The retaliation started on a Tuesday morning. I went out to get my mail and found a citation from the HOA. According to them, my mailbox was 2 inches too far from the curb. 2 inches. They were fining me $100 because my mailbox, which had been installed by the previous owner and hadn't moved in probably 20 years, was supposedly 2 inches out of compliance. The next day, another citation. This one was for non-compliant window treatments. Apparently, someone could see my curtains from the street, and they weren't the right color or style or something. Another $100 fine. Thursday brought a citation for my grass being too tall. According to their measurement, it was a 1/4 inch over the maximum allowed height. I'd literally mowed 3 days earlier. Another $100. I called Rebecca immediately. She told me to document everything. Take photos, write down dates and times, keep every single piece of paper they sent me. She said this was actually good for our case because it showed a clear pattern of harassment. Over the next 2 weeks, I got 9 more citations. My house number wasn't visible enough from the street. I had a garden hose that was supposedly stored improperly. My outdoor light was too bright. My driveway had a small oil stain. On and on and on. Each one came with a $100 fine. Helen was literally making things up to harass me. But something interesting started happening. My neighbors started noticing what was going on. The guy who lived 2 houses down stopped by one evening while I was taking photos of my perfectly fine mailbox for documentation. He asked what I was doing, and I explained the whole situation. His eyes got wide, and he said he couldn't believe Helen was still pulling this stuff. Still pulling this stuff? That caught my attention. I asked him what he meant, and he opened up about his own experience with the HOA. Turns out Helen had a reputation. She'd been on the board for almost 10 years, and during that time, she'd gone after dozens of residents. Usually it was people who disagreed with her at meetings or who hadn't supported her ideas. She'd find tiny violations, make up rules that didn't exist, and fine people until they either gave up and paid or moved away. He told me about an elderly couple 3 streets over who'd been fined repeatedly for having the wrong kind of flowers in their front yard. They'd eventually just stopped gardening altogether because they were afraid of getting more citations. Another family had been harassed for months over the color of their front door, until they finally repainted it just to make the harassment stop. As word spread about what was happening to me, more neighbors started coming forward. Some of them stopped by my house. Others called or sent emails. Every single one of them had a story about Helen. She'd target people she didn't like and make their lives miserable until they either fell in line or left the neighborhood. But here's the thing that really got me. Several of these neighbors also told me that Helen completely ignored violations when they were committed by her friends. One of the board members had a boat parked in his driveway that violated about 5 different rules, but Helen never said a word about it. Another one of her friends had added a deck to their house without getting HOA approval, which was explicitly against the rules, but nothing ever happened. Rebecca was building a file that got thicker every day. Every citation I received, every story from a neighbor, every example of selective enforcement, it all went into the case. She told me we were way past the point of just defending against the fines. We were going to go on the offense. One evening, about 3 weeks into this nightmare, I was sitting on my back porch when my phone rang. It was Rebecca. She said she'd been doing some digging into Helen's background and the HOA's history, and she'd found something interesting. Really interesting. Turns out Helen had tried to buy my property years ago. She'd made an offer to the previous owner, and he'd turned her down flat. Not only that, but she'd tried to get the HOA to force him to sell by claiming his property was somehow in violation of community standards. The previous owner had fought back, and Helen had eventually given up. Suddenly, everything made sense. This wasn't about rules or regulations or community standards. Helen wanted my property. She'd wanted it for years. And when I bought it, instead of her getting another chance at it, she'd decided to make my life so miserable that I'd give up and sell, probably to her at a discount just to escape the harassment. Rebecca asked me if I wanted to settle or fight. I didn't even hesitate. I told her we fight. Helen had picked the wrong person to mess with. I'd worked too hard, saved too long, and dreamed too much about this retirement to let some power-hungry HOA president bully me off my own property. Rebecca said that's exactly what she wanted to hear. Because we weren't just going to win this fight. We were going to make sure Helen could never do this to anyone else again. Rebecca filed the lawsuit on a Friday morning. She didn't just go after the fines or ask them to leave me alone. She filed for harassment, abuse of authority, and something called declaratory relief, which basically meant getting a judge to officially state that the HOA had no power over my lake. But that wasn't even the best part. She also filed a motion to have Helen removed from the HOA board completely. The legal term was disqualification, but what it really meant was kicking her out of her position. Rebecca argued that Helen had a massive conflict of interest because she'd tried to buy my property before and never disclosed it. She was using her power as HOA president to settle a personal grudge, and that was against every rule in the book. When Rebecca told me what she'd filed, I felt nervous and relieved at the same time. Nervous because lawsuits are scary, even when you're in the right. Relieved because someone was finally standing up to Helen in a way that actually mattered. The HOA had 30 days to respond to the lawsuit. During that time, the citations kept coming. Helen wasn't backing down. If anything, she got worse. I got cited for having my trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours. I got cited for having a bird feeder that was supposedly attracting too many animals. I even got cited for my car being parked at a slight angle in my own driveway. Every single citation went straight to Rebecca. Every photo I took, every measurement I made proving the citations were bogus, all of it went into the file. Rebecca told me to keep doing exactly what I was doing. The more Helen harassed me, the stronger our case became. But the citations weren't the only thing happening. The stress was getting to me in ways I hadn't expected. I'd moved here for peace and quiet, for a simple retirement where I could fish and relax. Instead, I was spending hours every week documenting violations, talking to my attorney, and dealing with legal paperwork. Some mornings I'd go down to the lake and just sit there without even casting my line, wondering if all of this was worth it. Then something happened that changed everything. One of my neighbors, an older guy named Tom who lived about 4 houses down, stopped by one evening. He'd heard about the lawsuit through the neighborhood grapevine, and he wanted to talk. We sat on my back porch, and he told me his story. 5 years ago, Tom had disagreed with Helen at an HOA meeting about a proposed fee increase. Nothing major, just a respectful difference of opinion, but Helen had taken it personally. For the next 6 months, she'd made his life miserable. Citations for everything imaginable. Threats of liens on his property. She'd even tried to get him kicked out of the neighborhood by claiming he was running an illegal business from his home, which was completely false. Tom had eventually given up and stopped attending meetings, stopped voting, basically just tried to stay invisible. He'd paid thousands of dollars in fines over the years, most of them for violations that either didn't exist or were so minor they shouldn't have mattered. He told me he regretted not fighting back and he wanted to help me in any way he could. Over the next week, more neighbors came forward. A woman who'd been fined for having the wrong shade of white paint on her fence. A family who'd been cited repeatedly for their kids' toys being visible in the yard. A retired couple who'd almost lost their home to a lien over unpaid fines for violations they'd never actually committed. The stories kept coming, and every single one of them pointed back to Helen. Rebecca was like a kid in a candy store. Every testimony, every receipt, every piece of documentation these neighbors provided made our case stronger. She started calling it a pattern of abuse rather than just harassment. This wasn't about me anymore. This was about years of Helen using her position to bully people who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. The HOA's response to the lawsuit finally came, and it was exactly what Rebecca expected. They denied everything, claimed all the citations were legitimate, and argued that the HOA had full authority over all properties in the neighborhood, including mine. Their attorney was clearly just going through the motions, throwing out standard legal defenses without really addressing the specifics of our case. But here's where things got interesting. Rebecca had also subpoenaed HOA records as part of the discovery process. That's the phase of a lawsuit where both sides have to share information and documents. The HOA had to turn over meeting minutes, financial records, correspondence, everything. When those documents arrived at Rebecca's office, she spent 2 full days going through them. Then she called me with news that made me smile for the first time in weeks. The records showed that Helen had been selectively enforcing rules for years. People she liked got warnings. People she didn't like got fines. Her friends on the board had multiple violations that were never addressed. Meanwhile, people who disagreed with her or questioned her decisions were hit with citation after citation. Even better, Rebecca found emails. Internal HOA board emails where Helen had actually written about wanting to make certain residents uncomfortable enough to leave the neighborhood. She'd discussed strategies for finding violations, talked about which residents to target, and even joked about how much money they were collecting in fines. It was all right there in black and white. Rebecca also discovered that Helen had tried to change the HOA charter a few years back. She'd wanted to eliminate grandfather clauses like the one that protected my lake. But she hadn't been able to get enough votes from the other board members. Some of them had actually argued against it, saying it wasn't fair to long-standing property owners. Helen had been furious, according to the meeting minutes. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't just about me and my lake anymore. This was about systemic abuse of power, selective enforcement, and using an HOA as a personal weapon against anyone who didn't fall in line. Rebecca scheduled a mediation for about 6 weeks after we filed the lawsuit. Mediation is where both sides sit down with a neutral third party and try to work things out before going to trial. Most cases settle at mediation because once everyone sees the evidence, they realize going to court is just going to cost more money and time. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at a conference room in a downtown office building. Rebecca told me to dress nicely but not to say much. She'd do most of the talking. My job was just to be there and look like a reasonable person who'd been wronged. Which wasn't hard because that's exactly what I was. When we walked into that conference room, Helen was already there with 2 other HOA board members and their attorney. Helen wouldn't even make eye contact with me. She sat there with her arms crossed, staring at the table, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. The mediator was a retired judge who'd been doing this kind of work for 20 years. She explained the process, talked about confidentiality, and then asked Rebecca to present our side of the case. Rebecca had prepared a presentation that was absolutely devastating. She walked through everything. The grandfathered status of my property, the bogus citations, the testimonies from other neighbors, the emails showing Helen's pattern of targeting residents, the conflict of interest with Helen trying to buy my property years ago. With each point Rebecca made, I watched the HOA's attorney get more and more uncomfortable. He kept looking at Helen with this expression that clearly said, "Why didn't you tell me about any of this?" The other board members looked shocked. It was obvious they hadn't known the full extent of what Helen had been doing. When Rebecca finished, the mediator asked the HOA's attorney if he wanted to respond. He asked for a private caucus, which meant they wanted to talk alone in a separate room. The mediator agreed, and they all filed out, leaving Rebecca and me sitting there. Rebecca looked at me and smiled. She said that request for a private caucus was a good sign. It meant they were realizing just how bad this looked for them. We waited for about 30 minutes before the mediator came back and asked to speak with Rebecca privately. They were gone for maybe 15 minutes. When Rebecca came back, she had this satisfied look on her face. She sat down next to me and said quietly, "They want to settle. And we're going to get everything we asked for, plus some things I didn't even think to ask for." The settlement negotiations took another hour. Rebecca would go talk to them, come back and update me, then go back for more discussions. Each time she came back, the deal got better. It was like watching someone who was really, really good at their job doing exactly what they were trained to do. Finally, Rebecca came back with the final offer written out on paper. She sat down next to me and walked me through every single point. The HOA was agreeing to everything, and I mean everything. First, Helen had to resign from the board immediately. Not in a month, not after some transition period, immediately. She had to submit her resignation letter before we even left the building that day. Second, the HOA had to issue a formal written apology to me. Not some vague, "we're sorry for any inconvenience" statement, but a real apology acknowledging that they'd harassed me, that all the citations were invalid, and that I had every right to use my lake however I wanted. Third, every single fine they'd issued me was being refunded, with interest. Turns out when you add up all those $100 citations plus the $500 fine, plus interest, it came to just over $2,000 that they owed me. Fourth, and this was the big one, they had to create a permanent written declaration stating that my property rights were protected and that the HOA had no authority over my lake. This wasn't just some internal memo. This was going to be recorded with the county, attached to my property deed so that no future HOA board could ever try this again. Fifth, they were paying my legal fees. All of them. Rebecca had kept careful track of every hour she'd worked, every filing fee, every expense. The total came to just under $30,000. The HOA's insurance company was going to cut a check for the full amount. And sixth, this was Rebecca's idea, and I loved it. The HOA had to send a letter to every single resident in Pinewood Estates explaining what had happened and informing them of their rights. If anyone else had been wrongly fined or harassed, they could come forward and have their cases reviewed. I sat there reading through the settlement agreement, and I couldn't believe it. We'd won. Not just won, but completely and totally won. Rebecca asked me if I wanted to accept the offer or try to push for more. I looked at her and said, "Let's take it." This was everything I'd wanted and more. We went back into the main conference room where Helen and the others were waiting. The mediator had everyone sign the settlement agreement. Helen's hand was shaking when she signed her name. She still wouldn't look at me. After all the signatures were done, Helen took out a piece of paper and wrote out her resignation letter right there at the table. 2 sentences. I resign from the HOA board effective immediately. This resignation is permanent. She signed it, dated it, and slid it across the table. The other board members looked relieved more than anything. The HOA's attorney looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The mediator thanked everyone for coming and said she was glad we could resolve this without going to trial. As we were packing up to leave, one of the other board members, a guy named Robert who I'd met briefly at that first HOA meeting, came over to me. He apologized quietly, saying he hadn't known what Helen was doing, that he felt terrible about it, and that things were going to change. He seemed genuine about it, so I shook his hand and told him I appreciated it. Rebecca and I walked out of that building into the sunshine, and I felt like a weight I'd been carrying for months just lifted off my shoulders. We went to lunch to celebrate, and Rebecca told me stories about other HOA cases she'd handled over the years. Apparently my situation wasn't even the worst she'd seen, which was kind of terrifying if you think about it. The HOA sent out the letter to all residents about a week later. My phone started ringing off the hook. Neighbors I'd never even met were calling to thank me for standing up to Helen. Several of them asked if they could talk to Rebecca about their own situations. A few people told me they'd been thinking about moving just to get away from the HOA harassment, but now they felt like maybe things would actually get better. Tom, the neighbor who'd first told me his story, stopped by with a bottle of wine. He said he wished he'd had the courage to fight back years ago, but he was glad someone finally did. We sat on my back porch, drank that wine, and he told me more stories about the neighborhood before Helen had taken over the board. It sounded like it used to be a really nice place to live, where people actually helped each other, instead of looking for violations to report. The formal apology from the HOA came in the mail about 2 weeks after the mediation. It was everything Rebecca had promised. Clear, direct, and acknowledging everything they'd done wrong. I made copies of it just in case and filed the original with all my other important documents. The property rights declaration got recorded with the county, and I got an official copy in the mail. Any future property owner, any future HOA board member, anyone who ever looked at my deed would see it right there in black and white. My lake was protected forever. The check for the legal fees took a little longer, but it eventually came through. Rebecca earned every penny of it and then some. I wrote her a review online that was probably too long and too gushing, but I didn't care. She'd done more than just win a legal case. She'd given me back my peace of mind. About a month after everything settled, the HOA had new elections. Robert, the board member who'd apologized to me, ended up becoming the new president. His first act was to review all outstanding fines and citations. Turns out dozens of residents had been unfairly fined over the years. The new board reversed almost all of them and issued refunds where appropriate. The whole atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. People started being friendlier. The HOA meetings became less formal and more like actual community gatherings. Someone organized a neighborhood barbecue, and probably 60 or 70 people showed up. It felt like a real community for the first time since I'd moved in. I heard through the grapevine that Helen had moved to a different county entirely. Apparently she'd had enough of Pinewood Estates. I didn't feel bad about it. She'd made her choices, and those choices had consequences. I just hoped wherever she ended up, she wouldn't have the power to make other people's lives miserable. As for me, I finally got back to the retirement I'd always dreamed about. My morning routine returned to normal. Wake up with the sun, make a pot of coffee, grab my fishing rod, and head down to the dock. Some mornings the fish are biting, some mornings they're not. It doesn't really matter. Just being out there is enough. The funny thing is, after everything that happened, I started inviting neighbors to come fish with me. Tom comes by most Saturday mornings. A few other people from the neighborhood have become regulars too. We don't always catch much, but we talk, we laugh, and we enjoy being out on the water. It's become this nice little tradition. One morning, a few months after everything settled, I was out on the dock with Tom and another neighbor. The sun was just coming up, the water was like glass, and I'd just hooked what felt like a pretty good-sized bass. As I was reeling it in, Tom said something that stuck with me. He said, "You know, I'm glad you didn't just give up and move. This neighborhood needed someone to stand up to her." I got that bass to the dock, and it was beautiful. Probably 5 pounds, maybe more. We took a picture, released it back into the water, and watched it swim away. I thought about what Tom had said. The truth is, I hadn't done anything special. I just refused to let someone bully me off my own property. I'd stood up for what was right, even when it was stressful and expensive and frustrating. But the bigger truth is that Rebecca had done most of the heavy lifting. She'd known exactly what to do, how to do it, and she'd fought like hell on my behalf. The legal system had actually worked the way it was supposed to work. Justice had been served, not because I was rich or connected or special, but because I was right and I had good help. Now I'm back to living the retirement I'd planned all along. Peaceful mornings, quiet evenings, and a lake full of fish that I can enjoy anytime I want. No HOA president looking over my shoulder. No citations in my mailbox. No deputies showing up at my dock. Just me, my coffee, my fishing rod, and all the time in the world, and you know what? It was worth every minute of the fight.